The island of Singapore was known to mariners at least by the 3rd century AD. By the 7th century, when a succession of maritime states arose throughout the Malay Archipelago, Singapore probably was one of the many trading outposts serving as an entrepot and supply point for Malay, Thai, Javanese, Chinese, Indian, and Arab traders. A 14th century Javanese chronicle referred to the island as Temasek, and a 17th century Malay annal noted the 1299 founding of the city of Singapura, Lion City, after a strange lion-like beast that had been sighted there. Singapura was controlled by a succession of regional empires and Malayan sultanates. European arrivals. Portuguese explorers captured the port of Malacca in 1511, forcing the reigning sultan to flee south, where he established a new regime, the Johor Sultanate, that incorporated Singapura. The Portuguese burned down a trading post at the mouth of the Temasek, Singapore River, in 1613. After that, the island was largely abandoned, and trading and planting activities moved south to the Riau Islands and Sumatra. However, planting activities had returned to Temasek by the early 19th century. In 1818, Temasek was settled by a Malay official of the Johor Sultanate and his followers, who shared the island with several hundred indigenous tribal people and Chinese planters. The year 1819 marked the arrival of Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, the lieutenant governor of the British enclave of Bengkulu on the west coast of Sumatra, and an agent of the British East India Company, who obtained permission from the local Malay official to establish a trading post. He called it Singapore, after its ancient name, and opened the port to free trade and free immigration on the south coast of the island, at the mouth of the Singapore River. At the time, Singapore had about 1,000 inhabitants. By 1827, Chinese had become the most numerous of Singapore's various ethnic groups. They came from Malacca, Penang, Riau, and other parts of the Malay Archipelago. More recent Chinese migrants came from the South China provinces of Guangdong and Fujian. British colonial period. During the 50 years following Raffles's establishment of his free trade port, Singapore grew in size, population, and prosperity. In 1824, the Dutch formally recognized British control of Singapore, and London acquired full sovereignty over the island. From 1826 to 1867, Singapore, along with 2 other trading ports on the Malay Peninsula, Penang and Malacca, and several smaller dependencies, were ruled together as the Straits Settlements from the British East India Company headquarters in India. In 1867, the British needed a better location than fever-ridden Hong Kong to station their troops in Asia, so the Straits Settlements were made a crown colony and its capital, Penang, ruled directly from London. The British installed a governor and executive and legislative councils. By that time, Singapore had surpassed the other Straits settlements in importance, as it had grown to become a bustling seaport with 86,000 inhabitants. Singapore also dominated the Straits Settlements Legislative Council. After the Suez Canal opened in 1869, and steamships became the major form of ocean transport, British influence increased in the region, bringing still greater maritime activity to Singapore. In 1953, a British commission recommended partial internal self-government for Singapore. In this milieu, other political parties began to form in 1954. One was the Labour Front, led by David Marshall, who called for immediate independence and merger with Malaya. The same year, the People's Action Party, PAP, was established under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew, a Cambridge-educated lawyer. The PAP also campaigned for an end to colonialism and a merger with Malaya. Following legislative assembly elections in 1955, a coalition government was formed with Marshall as chief minister. As a result of further talks with London, Singapore was granted internal self-government, while the British continued to control defense and foreign affairs. In 1957, Malaya was granted independence, and the next year the British Parliament elevated the status of Singapore from colony to state and provided for new local elections. The PAP swept the elections held in May 1959, and Lee Kuan Yew was installed as the first prime minister. The PAP's strongest opponents were communists, operating in both legal and illegal organizations. The most prominent was the Barisan Socialis, Socialist Front, a left-wing party that retained favor in the 1960s and early 1970s. There also were fears that communists within the PAP would seize control of the government, but moderates led by Lee held sway. In 1962, Singaporean voters approved the PAP's merger plan with Malaya, and on September 16, 1963, Singapore joined Malaya and the former British territories on the island of Borneo, Sabah, and Sarawak to form the Independent Federation of Malaysia. Only Brunei opted out of the federation. Independent Singapore. After separation from Malaysia on August 9, 1965, Singapore was forced to accept the challenge of forging a viable nation, the Republic of Singapore, on a small island with few resources beyond the determination and talent of its people. Under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew and the PAP, the new nation met the challenge. Confrontasi with Indonesia ended in 1966, while trade with Japan and the United States increased substantially, especially with the latter, since Singapore became a supply center for the increasing U.S. involvement in the Second Indochina War, 1954-75. In 1967, Singapore joined Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand in forming the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, for the purpose of promoting regional stability, economic development, and cultural exchange.